If you'll open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 8, we see that it's not until after the flood in Genesis chapter 8 that we have our first mentioning of the fourfold seasonal cycle that we are experiencing today. Or you've got at least some of the fourfold cycle here, and it would imply a fourfold cycle symbolizing life and death, the world that then was with the world that is today. The spring, summer, fall, winter, fourfold seasonal cycle. Genesis chapter 8, we can start back with verse 21. The Lord smelled a sweet savor. This is after the flood. The Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. The word should be though the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. While the earth remaineth. So it doesn't mean that we're going to have cold winters in the next life. This is only while this earth remains. Hallelujah. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat. Well, there's your winter and summer, and then it goes on to say, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So we have the limited, what we've called earlier, probably many months ago, you might not remember it, but limited uniformitarianism, where we said that after the flood, then we do have a limited process of uniformitarianism operating in the world today. You have things that were prior to the flood that are totally different, or I could say things that are today that were totally different than what they were prior to the flood because of the great change. But now when one animal dies, with the exception of some local catastrophe like a flood or a volcano or something like that, when one animal dies, he's going to die and his bones will stay there. A layer of dust, if enough centuries passes by, will cover him up. Then another animal will die on top of that, and so forth, where you'll end up with your oldest layers on the bottom and your newer layers on the top. That only makes sense. Now, what people have tried to do is take that back all the way through the eons of history to the very beginning. And that would be true except for the flood. You see, the flood not only interrupted history, but it interrupts many people's theories about the earth's history. Because they're trying to trace everything back to the very beginning by saying that we've gone from the simple to the complex, we've gone from our lower layers, which are older, to our newer layers, which are on top. And this simply is not true if you try to take that any earlier than Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 in the flood account. Now in verse 22, while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease, we have the beginning of our seasons. Now if you'll turn back to chapter 1, verse 14, the seasons that are mentioned here are different types of seasons. Let me just say that there still would be a temperature difference because the earth is still on its axis back in chapter 1, and it's still going to be revolving around the sun. So between what we would call winter today and what we would call summer today, there would be a temperature difference, but it would be like 3 or 4 or 5 degrees, not like 50 or 100 degrees. Obviously, it doesn't matter whether you have a greenhouse effect or not. If you get so many more million miles away from the sun and you're tilted the opposite way from the sun, it's going to be a little cooler. But the thing about the greenhouse effect, it'll take some warmth from another part of the earth and distribute it all over the earth. But you're still going to have some type of minor difference, and that's why it does mention seasons, although they're not the full-fledged climatic seasons that we experience today. Genesis 1 and verse 14. God said, let there be lights in the expanse of heaven to divide the day from the night. So they had day and night back then. Remember, that was two of the things mentioned in 8:22. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. So we did have seasons, but they were the seasons of the planets and of the stars, of the sun and of the moon, and they were not the seasons of climate that would affect man here on the earth. Now, this climatic change, which didn't come about until after the flood, the fairly uniform temperature on the earth prior to Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 would be the only logical result of Genesis 1, verses 6, 7, and 8, if you'll turn back there, which is known as the waters above and the waters below, or as others have called it, and we've adopted the terminology, the pre-flood water vapor canopy. So we'll say a few more things about this as we go along this evening because it ties in directly with our subject, if you'll think back last week and remember what we were on. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Now this is the primeval earth that is composed of, relatively speaking, nothing but water at this time. A shoreless sea, remember, and I said we've only had two of those. In the beginning and with the flood, you end up with a shoreless sea. Think about it if that doesn't explain itself. And God made the expanse and divided the waters which were under the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and the morning was day 2. Now you've got what we call the waters, or I shouldn't say what I call, what the Bible calls the waters above and the waters below. Now in verses 9 and 10, he goes on immediately to begin to deal with the waters below by gathering them together in various bodies, because remember the word is in the plural, and he calls these seas. So we've got no problems with the waters below. We only have the questions concerning the reality or the definition of the waters above. Now we looked in the whole message earlier that it does not refer to clouds. It does not refer to outer space invaders that came too close to the earth and part of it melted and so forth. This refers to an entire water vapor canopy that was supernaturally lifted up and suspended in the earth's atmosphere. Now we could wish that more books on geology, more books on earth history, more books on climatology and different subjects like that would give some type of discussion of this, because not only does the Bible speak of it, but as we saw last week, the facts of earth history prove that something like this, and I can't think of anything besides this, so it's really not something like this, it had to have been this, existed at some time in the earth's history in order for there to be 90-foot plum trees and palm trees and bison and antelope and of course the Siberian woolly mammoth and a lot of other animals and plants and trees that shouldn't be there to be 600, 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle or anywhere near the Arctic Circle. None of them should be there. Just the 1 or 2 inch high little willow plant is all that grows. But of course we know that no books that are used in schools today give any indication that they even know of anything like this. I'll say more about that here in a few moments. But this verse that we have in chapter 8, verse 22 is very important because it shows us several different interesting items. First of all, and you get this from Genesis 1, 6 to 8, tying that in with chapter 8 and 22. That's why we read both of them together. But besides there being no seasons due to the fact that we have this huge water vapor canopy that's been lifted up, there are several other results that would logically have followed from this. First of all, there would have been no rain on the earth. The earth would have been watered by a mist. Now, some of these thoughts have actually been presented to professors in these various scientific disciplines at public colleges and universities, giving them the hypothetical belief and allowing them to assume that it's hypothetical that at one time the earth did have this water vapor canopy around it. It was surrounded by this, and given that fact, then these scientists who are professionals, although they're sometimes agnostic or atheist or whatever, or some other religion, but given this fact, they can actually predict the same results that would have occurred just like we find them here in the Bible. If you'll turn back to chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, this is one of the things that they have predicted when they didn't even know about the Bible. They'd say, well, if that was true, then the earth would have had no rain at that time. It would have had to have been watered by a mist. Just what the Bible said. You see, during the cool of the day, as a matter of fact, chapter 3, verse 8 talks about the cool of the day. So there was a period in the day when it was cooler than during the midday time period when the sun would be high in the sky. During the cool of the day, when the temperatures would have fallen just a little, then the moisture in the air would have condensed as water vapor, and it would have condensed out as mist, which is just what chapters 5 and 6 say. There was no shrub of the field in the earth. There was no plant of the field that grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground, but there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Now, whether we want to translate Ed as mist or as referring to subterranean waters, we would still end up with mist, whether this happens to be talking about subterranean waters or not, because of the fact that when the temperatures did begin to fall in the cool of the day, in the evening of the day, then moisture in the atmosphere would have condensed out as mist, and this would have been the adequate moisture needed for the plants in order for them to be able to survive. Secondly, there would have been no clouds. With no seasons, we would have no clouds. And with the pre-flood water vapor canopy, there would be no clouds, which is what chapter 9 implies. Thirdly, there would have been no rainbow. No clouds means no rainbow. But not only that, a rainbow only forms when the size of the water droplets get somewhere close to the size of rain itself. And the size of the droplets of rain range anywhere from around 0.4 to 4 millimeters. 0.4 to 4 millimeters. And if that's the size of a droplet of rainwater, and in order for a rainbow to form, which remember is made out of nothing but droplets of water, but that aren't quite large enough to fall as rain, around 0.3, then if there's no rainbow, then there could be no rain, or to say it another way, if there's no rain, then there could be no rainbow. Because if you've got droplets that have gone above 0.4 millimeters, then probably you've got some water droplets that are still below that, around 0.2 or 0.3 millimeters, which is what it would take for a rainbow to be seen on the earth. This is seen in chapter 9, verses 12 through 17. Another effect that we would get from tying chapter 1 and chapter 8 together with the pre-flood water vapor canopy is that the air masses would be the same density and have the same pressure, which means that we would only have had minor air movement until the time of the flood. Now this is seen, a proof of this, in chapter 8 and verse 1. You see, all of these results here are predictable simply upon the basis of chapter 1, verses 6 to 8. You can predict all type of things about what the climate would have been like at that period if you're discerning enough to read Genesis, or if you're just diligent enough and read with open eyes verses 6, 7, and 8 of Genesis chapter 1. Then you, if you knew anything about weather and climate, which most of you don't, but if you did, then you'd be able to predict some of the results of this water vapor canopy yourself. You wouldn't have to have me come along and say them or hear them in school or read them out of some textbook. You'd be able to predict these, because these would be the inevitable results of having the earth surrounded by a water vapor canopy. Now in chapter 8 and verse 1, we have our first mentioning of any wind coming. And remember, if we've got this pre-flood water vapor canopy, then since the density and the pressure of air is going to be relatively the same, then you can't have, you see, what causes the winds is when you get warm air and cool air together. Then sometimes you end up with too much wind, and they call that storms and tornadoes and a whole lots of different things in. When you get your different temperatures, then you've got different weight. Obviously, your cold air weighs more and has greater pressure than your hot air, and that's why when you get them together, they don't have to be moving as far as blowing wind. Just get them close together and watch what happens. You'll get wind. That's the inevitable result. God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. Chapter 8 and verse 1. That would have been the only result that we could come up with the fall of the canopy when we're going to discuss the pressure and the intensity of the air. You'd have to end up with some type of movement in the atmosphere that you wouldn't have had prior to this time. Now, you don't have to be a Christian. You just have to know something about science in order to come up with these things. And one final result would have been that there would have been practically no temperature difference between the poles and the equator. Obviously, there would have been some, depending on where the Earth was in its orbit around the sun. You might have a little cooler, or you might have a little warmer temperature at the pole than at the equator, or vice versa. Now, the mentioning of the poles and the temperature there brings us immediately back to what we were talking about last week, which was the discussion of the cataclysmic destruction and burial of, it's been estimated, 5 million Siberian woolly mammoths. Now, no one asked this question last week, but it's one that we ought to ask right away, and that is, did Charles Darwin know about these mammoths? Yes, he certainly did. And you know what his response was? I have no response. At least he was honest. But he says, I've got no answer. I can't explain how that would have happened upon the basis of what he had been taught by his grandfather and upon the basis of what he thought he had learned himself from studying different birds on different islands when he's traveling around the world on the ship known as the Beagle. These things couldn't have happened. And what's more than that, another man, Charles Lyell, whom we haven't discussed that much, but will be on in several months, who is more famous in the area of uniformitarianism than Darwin himself, he had an answer to it. And you know what his answer was? All of these mammoths got caught in a cold snap while they were swimming one day. Now, if it wasn't so funny, we could get mad at someone who professes to know anything about anything and be as ignorant as that. Are we going to assume that they're all out there chewing bean pods and buttercups? Remember, that's what ends up in their stomach. The bean pods are still between their teeth. What are they doing chewing bean pods? All of them out there swimming. Are we going to assume that all 5 million of them took a dip at the same time? It's good to laugh some of these things off because you have to get aggravated at someone like that. I mean, all it would take is reading a statement like that in his book, Principles of Geology, and I'd file that thing in the wastepaper basket.
Amen.
Because the man like that is dishonest.
Right.
It's one thing to be wrong and be honest about it. I mean, Darwin says, I don't know. So that's one thing. It's another thing to be wrong and to be dishonest about it at the same time. That's something I have a hard time tolerating. If the fellow wants to be wrong, that's all right. Be agnostic to yourself. Be an atheist in your closet. And if you're going to pretend to be a scientist or something, then stay with the facts. Stay away from hypothesizing about things when you have no substantial evidence that these things ever did exist. Someone like that doesn't deserve to be listened to. You know, it's one thing if you can dig up some bones and put something together as a result of the bones and end up with Cro-Magnon. At least you've got, well, we can't call it a fact, but you've got evidence there. It's evidence that points to something different than you're trying to use it for, but at least you've got evidence. But you've got no evidence to say that all 5 million Siberian woolly mammoths took a dip at the same time. All of them were eating bean pods and buttercups. And some of them were frozen sitting down on grass. Now, how are you going to do all that at the same time? That'd pretty much be impossible. And besides that, we don't have cold temperatures there. Buttercups and beans wouldn't be growing. You see, these men knew about the existence of the woolly mammoths. And they appear infrequently in scientific journals, but no one knows what to do with them, though. So just like the denominational church of our day, as soon as you present them with the miraculous, present to them the miraculous, they're going to sweep it under the rug of skepticism.
That's right. Amen.
Oh, well, God doesn't work miracles today. People don't speak in tongues. They're going to put it under the rug of skepticism. Doesn't matter what the question is, you just let it involve the supernatural. Now, if you don't believe me here, you go tell your Baptist next-door neighbor about the Holy Spirit and tongues and see what he does with that. Tell him about demons. Tell him that his daughter, his son, has a demon, and that's why they act the way they do. You'll end up in trouble. You'll end up needing faith or the angels in a hurry. Because, I mean, even some Christians, even when you want to help them, they'll get upset with you if you even insinuate that maybe their child or maybe they have a demon. And that's why they've got the problem. Oh, they'll go to a psychiatrist, a head shrinker, and have their head shrunk for $50 an hour. And they don't mind doing that. But you let them know that it involves another realm that they can't touch and weigh and put in a test tube and analyze. And they're going to be upset with you in a hurry. And this is where scientists get upset with us. But really they shouldn't be, because they're the ones who dug up the facts and the evidence that we're using to show you that the Bible has been true all along.
Amen.
Whether the woolly mammoths were ever discovered or not, we could have predicted all these things from a little study of the Scriptures. Now, it just helps when we find these things, because then you go back to the Word of God and you think, well, then where does the Bible indicate that this at least could have taken place? And right away you find it. Back there in creation, or you find it there with the flood, or you find it with Joshua's missing day, or you find it with the partial day that's missing with Hezekiah. You'll find your answer somewhere when you get back there in the supernatural records that God has. You might not find it painted on the Cro-Magnon walls of a cave in France, but you'll find it in the Word of God, though. But man, with his educated idiot box, does not want to take God truthfully for what he said. And I just have to believe quite firmly that people who don't believe these things probably don't even have their salvation. Because that's something you'll never analyze. I mean, when you get there, you won't be trying to analyze it, so you can safely say that's something you'll never analyze. If you're ever trying to analyze it, it probably proves you don't have it. Because all you got to do is read John 3. And Jesus said to Nicodemus, this is spiritual teaching here, that a man must be born again. Nicodemus wants to know, well, then how can that happen? He said, well, the wind blows where it listeth, the Spirit blows where he listeth. So is everyone that's born of the Spirit. That can't be explained. Go ahead and try to explain the new birth to someone. If Jesus couldn't, I doubt you can. I think that's on safe ground. If he can't explain what the new birth is, oh, we can get theological and talk about regeneration and imputation, but what does that really tell you, though? It gives you the theological basis for one's salvation, but it still doesn't tell you, well, what actually happened that made you all of a sudden a new creature in Christ? Well, you just take them John 3 and show them that it can't be explained. But what I'm saying is that man in his educated ivory towers in which he sits today will look miracles and will look even statistics that he himself has tabulated in his scientific textbooks. When we say, well, maybe these are the results of what God has said in his Word, like Noah's flood and his cracker box floating over the world, maybe what you've drawn up there are the results of that flood. Oh, no. They'll be the first to deny that. But yet they'll welcome with open arms any new theory, such as punctuated equilibrium. You remember when we studied that? Oh, no. They finally discovered that man isn't evolving slowly. All of a sudden, someone laid an egg and out came a hippopotamus. Whatever you want to say. I mean, it doesn't make any difference. You take your pick, I'll take mine. A bird laid an egg and hatched a hippopotamus. That's called punctuated equilibrium. That way we don't have any gaps to explain. But you can't explain that, though. You see, that's what's mind-boggling, to think that they'll, with open arms, welcome a theory like that, but turn you away when you bring them some things that really make a lot of sense.
Amen.
I mean, the Bible, as I've said earlier in this series, expects us to take God at His word first of all and trust Him that what He said is true. But then He'll give us a little understanding of that with our mind, because we live in a physical world, and He doesn't just sweep the senses under the rug, but He wants us to exercise faith first of all. I mean, He doesn't expect you to walk out your trial of healing forever and ever. Pretty soon He's going to let you feel like you're healed. But He wants you to take Him for Him at His word in the first place. And then you'll get the results of that. It's the same with your loved ones or your child that's being more disobedient than you would like them to be. He expects you to take that on faith, that they are restored according to your faith in the promises of God. And then He'll let you see that as a result. The same thing is true here with the Genesis flood or with creation. He expects us to believe what He said. And I believe what He said. I don't care if that puts me in a category of uneducated people. They talk about people who really believe in a literal creation flood as uneducated, naive, who haven't studied the facts. It doesn't matter if that's what they think about us.
Amen.
Because we've already read, or I've read 1 Corinthians 1, and God doesn't choose many wise, many noble, many rich, many honorable. He chooses the debased and the things that are not to bring to naught the things that think they are, so that no flesh can glory in His presence. He likes it when His children just humbly bow before Him and say, Lord, You said it, and that's why I believe it. And then He'll generally give you some sense understanding and some intellectual knowledge about that subject that you're saying that you believe by faith. I mean, heaven is one good example about it. If we're believing that by faith we're going there, we're not going to stay there forever, but we are going there, then He's going to give us the evidence of that one day. But until then, Hebrews 11:1, faith is the evidence until it's manifested. And then you'll no longer have to believe in your salvation that you have it by faith, because you'll have it because you're there. You can't have faith for something that you see. The greatest problems for the uniformitarians revolve around the following facts that I want to give you. I said the greatest problems for those that believe in some form of uniformitarianism prior to Genesis 8:22 revolve around one or more or all of the following facts. Remember that we're back on our subject of last week and the mammoths in the Arctic region. First of all, the sheer number of them. It's been estimated that we've got 5 million Siberian mammoths that are buried somewhere north in Siberia and Alaska of the Arctic Circle. Whenever there's a minor thaw, bones wash up on beaches all around the area. Whenever there's a little greater thaw, the stench is something terrible. People say that have ever visited the area, it smells like rotting flesh, which is just what it would be if you could get a carcass up below, or up above, I should say, the frozen muck that it's been in, get it exposed to, doesn't have to be temperatures above freezing, just get it exposed to 20-degree temperature rather than 50 below zero, whatever it was. Get it up near that, and you're going to begin to have some change in the composition and the makeup, and as a result, you're going to have a change in the odor. Wouldn't have brought any odor prior to that, and you're going to have a terrible odor as a result of that. You see, one or two frozen examples really wouldn't be a problem to uniformitarianism. But the problem is seen in the fact that we've got estimated 5 million of these creatures there. You see, one or two frozen examples really wouldn't be a problem to uniformitarianism. But the problem is seen in the fact that we've got estimated 5 million of these creatures there. 50,000 tusks have been taken so far in the ivory trade of these animals. As a matter of fact, in one dig alone, 20,000 tusks of these animals were found. Still frozen, still preserved. You've got articles everywhere from Encyclopedia Britannica to Saturday Evening Post that deal with the subject of the possibility of the extinction of the Indian elephant, and then where will we go for our ivory that we need? And they all say we'll go to Siberia because there you've got more ivory than's ever been discovered before. They found 50,000 tusks, but remember, if you've got 5 million animals, then you're going to have several million. All of them wouldn't have tusks, but you're going to have several million tusks there. They've only found 50,000. 50,000 is a drop in the bucket to just 5 million tusks that would still be preserved somewhere in that region. No problem with keys on pianos then, and whatever else they want to use ivory for. Of course, they are substituting things now because that's pretty expensive. Ivory's expensive because it's illegal to just go shooting down Indian elephants. Of course, people do it anyway. They're called poachers, and if you ever get caught for that, you're in trouble. They do it anyway, but that's illegal to do, and you just don't have everyone shooting down elephants just to get their tusks off of them. There's not much ivory in the world. Ivory trade is not a big trade and not a thing to get in if you want to make a lot of money. Unless you want to go to Siberia. I guess it would be the business to get into. You'd want to pick somewhere towards the end of July when you went. Carry a lot of dynamite. And you see, remember that you have to get those things quickly before they thaw out, because you can't be off the animal more than 5 hours or it deteriorates. It's no good at all. It won't work as ivory then. So you've got to get it off there quickly. If it's not on the animal, if it's already loose, which it could have been knocked loose and then frozen, we'll discuss more about the actual process of this freezing in a few moments. But you'd still have to get it out of the ice quickly and get it transported wherever you want to have it and get it cut up the way you want to, or it's not going to be any good for you. A second fact that poses a problem to those that believe in some form of uniformitarianism is the position of many of the animals. Why an upright or walking position? You see, most animals don't die as they're walking. I mean, if they do, then they end up on their side. Gravity pulls them down. That's the only logical result. I guess animals could end up dead standing up, but they won't continue standing up once they're dead. They're going to fall over. Now, the problem is, why and how are we finding these animals that are in an upright position? They're dead. I mean, don't anyone think that you're going to actually thaw these things out and bring them back to life like a science fiction movie, that you can freeze a heart or something and then thaw it out 100 years from now and they'll start pumping again. Those things really won't work. The mammoths that died then, they're still dead even when we dig them up. Proof of that is just let them sit there a while. But why do we have some of them in walking positions? You see, if they were killed, that's fine. Someone shot them with a bow and arrow and killed them, that's fine. But why in an upright position? Thirdly, the mouth and stomach remains of the animals present great problems. As we said before, beings still in the pods been found in the teeth, between the teeth of the animals. Stomach remains. What happens to food you put in your stomach? Very quickly, what happens to it? Your digestive system takes over very quickly. Yet we have found in the stomach remains of these animals buttercups with fine details still in the flour. It's not that they were, we had to do a chemical test on it before we found out what it really was. It actually looked like a buttercup. Now, can you imagine, you know how thin a buttercup is. Can you imagine how quickly that would be digested in the stomach of a Siberian woolly mammoth? Unless something happened to him very quickly right after he ate that buttercup. That's the problem. Just remains in the stomach is not that great a problem, but why are so much of the remains in perfect condition that you can see fine line details and little veins right in the leaves and everything? Digestive juices had not even begun to work upon the plants and vegetable matter that these creatures had swallowed. Fourthly, the presence of fresh meat. We're talking about facts that pose the greatest problems to those that believe in uniformitarianism. The presence of fresh meat. In the 1930s, a journalist named Joseph Barnes from the New York Herald Tribune testified to the delicious flavor of mammoth steaks after he was fed some at the Russian Academy of Sciences. This was in the late 1930s. Now, this is a journalist from the New York Herald Tribune, Joseph Barnes. You see, it wasn't that great of a problem when these men began to discover these creatures in the first place, and the dogs that had led their sled team there began to eat some of the meat because they think, well, dogs will eat anything. I can make a comment on that. Dogs will eat just about anything. Dogs will eat rotten meat. But when a dog eats rotten meat, he always gets sick as a result of that. He will eat it if he's hungry, but he'll always get sick as a result of that. And I remember reading one account of a team that had gone there and the dogs had eaten part of the meat and then gotten back to some outpost of civilization, and they had talked to a veterinarian about their dogs, and he said, oh, the dogs would have gotten sick right away if that was a mammoth carcass that was rotted. So the only thing you can end up with, it was not rotted flesh. It was preserved, perfectly preserved flesh on the animal. Just like taking a steak out of your freezer and then go ahead and eating it. And he described it with the two words of wholesome and delicious. I'm talking about Joseph Barnes. Now, if you keep meat frozen too long, it's just not very good. I mean, it's edible. It won't kill you if you eat it. Maybe none of you know this. Maybe you've never eaten meat that's just been frozen too long. But you certainly wouldn't describe it as delicious and wholesome. It would be edible. It would not kill you. It would not be rotten. But it would not be delicious and wholesome unless you kept it at a very, very low temperature. And I don't mean like 31 or 29 degrees. I mean much lower than that. You'd have to keep it at a very low temperature before you could describe it as delicious or as wholesome food. Now these are our four problems that we bring up to the uniformitarians. They can't answer the problems because they can't answer the whole question of the preservation of the Siberian woolly mammoths. And really the only answer we have is COLD. And I'm not talking about 31 or 29. But that's the only answer we have. Now remember what we're talking about as we're discussing this. We're talking about the flood. We're talking about water, not cold temperatures. But cold temperatures have worked their way into our subject because they worked their way into the Earth's environment back in Noah's day. I can give you another statistic about meat and its preservation. The Armour Meat Company. Now, if you want to know where I got all these statistics, I just had to study and read a lot. The Armour Meat Packing Company. You've heard of Armour Meats. Tell us that an animal would rot in 32 to 48 hours. Talking about an animal laid out exposed. Would rot in 32 to 48 hours without temperatures far below freezing. Now you see, you might think that if an animal died out there and it's 25 degrees, that it's just going to freeze him and preserve him. No, it won't either. He'll begin to rot in 32 to 48 hours, unless it's something like 50 below zero. Now keep in mind zero and freezing. It's too bad that we've ended up with that scale. We in America work on a scale of a system of 10. And freezing and zero should be the same thing. That would only be logical. But instead, zero is 0 and freezing is 32, and boiling should be 100 and it's 212. So keep in mind the differences there. It's a backward system that we've ended up with when you're going to measure temperatures in Fahrenheit, and that's what we use anyway. There's no sense in talking about some other system of measurement, whether it's centigrade or some other, or Celsius, since we don't use those. Basically speaking, we in America don't use those. Now, everyone's trying to get us converted to be like the rest of the world, going to the metric system and so forth. But when I say below zero, I'm not talking about below freezing. I'm talking about below zero, because there's a 32-degree difference between zero and freezing. 25 degrees is not very cold. 25 below zero is quite a bit cold, and quite a bit colder than just 25 degrees. 25 is still freezing, but it's not very cold. I think I gave the example last time, even if you try to freeze water, just get it down to around 31, and it's going to take a while for that water to freeze. It'll freeze because as long as it's 32 or below, that's freezing, so water will freeze, unless there's wind, and it won't freeze then. You'd have problems right away then, because lakes don't freeze over when it gets 32 degrees. In all the years that I can remember living in Mississippi, our lake froze over one time. And it was always 32 or below 32 in January, at least a couple of days out of January. But that doesn't affect the water in the least, because first of all, that's not going to freeze anything very quickly, certainly not a lake, and secondly, it's not going to freeze it when you've got wind blowing over it, any type of breeze. You've got to get down pretty cold and stay down fairly cold. Now, if you get cold enough, it doesn't matter whether the wind's blowing or not. The water, the lake's still going to freeze. So what actually happened? We're on Genesis flood. Everyone thought the flood did all this. We're not talking about water now. We're talking about temperatures. You see, it'd be one thing to say all the mammoths were drowned. That's what you probably all believed until we got on this. Well, the flood came and the water went over all the earth, and the water destroyed all of the creatures. It drowned all of them. But some of them it didn't drown. Some of them, the water never had a chance to drown. Because on one warm, sunny fall afternoon, something happened in Siberia. And it's interesting that the berries and things that they have found in the stomachs point towards the time that we've told you before, the fall, where you'd have everything ripe and beginning to produce then. Points to the same time period, sometime in the fall, maybe like around November. Everything's nice and ripe then. They're eating buttercups and berries and nuts. A warm afternoon. No one's expecting, the animals at least, no one is expecting what's fixing to take place. Let me see if we can give you a picture. You might want to write as much as you can down on just what happened. Because it will give you a deeper and better understanding of earth history when you dislodge from your mind the misconception that the flood drowned all of God's creatures, because it most certainly didn't. There are some other things that we have to consider. Well, chapter 7, verse 11 gives us the twofold source of the waters. The most important of these for right now is the source of the waters above, called here the floodgates, the sluice gates, the windows of heaven. The end of Genesis 7 and verse 11 were open. Now what this means is that God would have supernaturally changed the water vapor canopy, would have changed vapor, would have condensed it into droplets of rain, and it would have begun to rain like it had never rained before. Of course, any rain would have been like it had never rained before. But it began to rain, as we would say, cats and dogs. But when the water vapor canopy began to collapse, now it went on for 40 days and 40 nights raining. So all of the water didn't get here all at the same time. That helps us, by the way. We don't want it to all get here, or that's going to hurt some of our theories that we have. Someone asked me several weeks ago, or whenever it was, do we have a lot of text for these things? And I believe I said, no, we don't, but we do have some, and that's why I want to make sure we get out of the ones that we do have what we can, because we don't have a lot that tell us exactly what happened. But if you take chapter 1, the verses that we've already discussed this evening, chapter 8, chapter 7, verse 11, chapter 8, verse 1, all these different ones that all tie in together, then you end up with some logical conclusions. No, they're not provable facts because we didn't live there. No one was taking a picture of what happened. So we can't call them provable facts or demonstratable facts. You can't demonstrate that. That was a non-repeatable event that took place. But we do have logical results and logical conclusions. Now, it's one thing to be illogical in your conclusions. Lyell and all the animals swimming got caught during a cold snap. That's illogical. Now, if he wants to say something else that's logical, it may be wrong, but as long as it's logical, we'll listen to it then. Then we'll have to see, does the Bible frown on that, or does the Bible smile on that? You see, the Bible's not going to say, yes, you're right, with your belief on it happened on November the 1st, 4 in the afternoon, and I'll show you exactly what volcano let out how much water. No, that's not going to take place. But God can smile or frown on conclusions that we draw, whether from evidence that we have in the sense realm or from texts that we have here in the Word of God. So back to chapter 7, verse 11. When the floodgates of heaven opened up and the water vapor canopy began to condense into rain droplets, water droplets, and began to fall, then immediately, and we'll discuss more of this later on, just get down what you can understand for right now. Immediately, the temperatures at both poles, because of their location on a spherical surface here, the temperature at both poles would have instantaneously dropped several hundred degrees below zero. Now remember, those that don't even believe that this happened will tell us that did happen if you had a water vapor canopy and if it condensed like you said that it did. Then yes, this would be the result. The temperature at the poles would have immediately dropped in 150 to 250 degrees below zero. Now the temperatures would have had to have fallen that quickly, that rapidly, because if they didn't, although we could still get frozen mammoth carcasses, there would be ice crystals formed in their cells. And the only way to keep ice crystals out of the cells is to drop 150 to 250 degrees below zero, and it freezes so quickly and so rapidly, it does it before ice crystals have an opportunity or a chance to form in the cells of the animal. Now you need to get that down and remember that, because that's very important. Now none of these animals have ice crystals in their cells. They've been frozen that rapidly, that quickly. And when you do it that quickly, then you're going to be able to preserve that animal in a very fresh, wholesome, delicious state and condition. 25 degrees below zero would not have done it. The cells would have filled with ice crystals. The meat would have been no good whatsoever. But when you go down to 200 degrees below zero, then, and you consider a wind chill factor as well. Now, of course, the wind would have been blowing at the poles stronger than it would have been, say, where Noah was in Mesopotamia region. The wind would have been blowing more, so you have to consider the wind chill factor, which maybe was 250 or 300 degrees below zero. Now, that doesn't affect, living here in this state, you know that wind chill does not affect, let's say, the starting of your automobile. Now, some people don't even realize that. Wind chill doesn't matter whether it's 100 below zero, if that's the wind chill, or 10 below zero without the wind chill. It makes no difference. It's the temperature that bothers the car. But when you come to a body, a human body, animal body, then they're susceptible to wind chill. And when it's 10 below and then it's 100 below with wind chill, then you've got very, very cold temperatures. Then you're going to have rapid freezing take place. Now, I'm not talking about something small like frostbite. None of us have been, well, no one has been, where it's 250 degrees below zero and the wind's blowing at the same time. Can you imagine what would happen to you? You would freeze in an upright position. You wouldn't have time to keel over and die. And you see, remember, we're talking about huge elephants now, mammoths. These are tremendous creatures. It's one thing to freeze a little black-capped chickadee. It's another thing to freeze 1,000 or 2,000 pound woolly mammoth. It's covered with wool on the outside and skin, and then he's several feet thick to end with. And you're going to have temperatures just like blast freezing that would go right through his skin, right to his heart, and freeze all of it just like that. Now, the only thing that we have comparable to this today is known as liquid nitrogen. It's the only thing that can get a temperature, well, it can't get, I don't think, that cold, but it can get down colder than you'll ever experience it. And liquid nitrogen can do that. But they weren't submerged in liquid nitrogen. It was a warm, sunny afternoon, no doubt in the fall. You've got 5 million woolly mammoths roaming Siberia, 600 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Some of them sitting down, some of them walking, some of them eating buttercups, some eating bean pods. And of course it would have begun to rain. It began to rain all over the earth. But as it began to rain, the temperatures would have immediately gone below. And it would have had to have happened after it began to rain. And as soon as it began to rain, after that, the temperatures would immediately have gone 200 degrees below zero. Of course, you wouldn't have any rain in that area after that. But you need to keep this in mind, that the Arctic seas were warm seas at this time. And with the rainfall and with the winds at the poles, you're going to have turbulence in the water. So with the mixture of the frozen crystals and so forth that had already fallen with the warm seas, you're going to keep some things unfrozen for at least a short period of time. Don't think that everything, the sea from the top all the way to the bottom, 1,000 fathoms, froze all the way to the bottom. It couldn't have done that, not even with 200 degrees below zero, not that quickly, because the temperature starts up here and begins to work its way down. And at the bottom of the ocean, at the bottom of the Arctic Sea, it's warm there. So it's going to take some time mixing some of the cold with some of the warm, and before you know it, you're going to end up with the polar caps, which we'll discuss maybe next week. But what we're discussing now is that you would end up with the mammoths. Now, remember that not all of them have been preserved whole and complete. This is because those that would have been frozen quickly, all of them would have been frozen quickly, but some of them could have also fallen in water, or with the rain coming quickly, could have been engulfed in some of that warm mixed with cool or cold water. And although they would end up frozen, parts of them anyway, decay would set in because of the warm temperatures that the water would have. You got to keep the point in mind that the temperatures have to go there, and the animal has to be in that environment the whole time to remain that cold. What about those that were preserved? They got buried in sediment and were protected from the water. And as soon as they got buried in sediment, then the sediment would have frozen over. And you get a thick enough piece of sediment, and it's on land, and it doesn't matter how much water you've got there. Very shortly you're going to end up with so much cold temperatures and ice that has fallen, then you're going to change those warm seas into what you've got now, a mile thick of nothing but ice. And the animals that had been preserved in sediment before they went into that would end up as we are seeing them discovered today. That's why a lot of them are found along creek banks and things, because they were buried there, and this is where they've come up. Now, this would have taken place at both poles, North Pole and South Pole. Now, the reason we're discovering so many mammoths whole and complete is because of their size. The water would not have torn them apart or just obscured them in so many tons of sediment like it would have smaller creatures. That's why we're finding generally these large mammoths, because they are so large that they would be easy to find, assuming that you've got a warm summer or whatever the conditions that we would have now that would be able to unearth some of these creatures. Now, this may seem a little confusing to you right now, but we'll be getting into more of it next week when we discuss some of the changes on the Earth's surface. We're only looking at it right now with regard to the mammoths. But this will point your mind away, as I said before, from the misconception that all of them were drowned, because they simply would not have been in these positions. Now, that's all right for creatures in Noah's area. It didn't get cold there because you're not at the poles. You see, the poles are what make the difference because of the tilt of the Earth in its relation to the sun. That's always what makes the difference. That's why the Arctic is always cold, and that's why the Antarctic region is always cold. And everything in between, it might be cold sometimes, it might be warm sometimes, it might be warm all the time. But where it's cold all the time is the top and the bottom. As I say, because of the 23.5 degree tilt of the Earth in relationship to the sun. Now, that still really doesn't answer our question about extinction, because Noah had 2 mammoths on board. Now, we don't have any woolly mammoths around today. Now, it's one thing to destroy 5 million of them in Siberia, but it's another thing to end up with 0 woolly mammoths today, because Noah had 2 of them on board. 2 of all the things that are now extinct, Noah had on board with him, or representatives of certain species or subspecies or kinds, as Genesis 1 calls them, would have been on board the ark. How can we explain their extinction? Well, very easily as follows. Once we've got these tremendous temperature changes, then whenever Noah and the animals disembark from the ark, the hostile environment and the fight for food would have simply pushed some creatures right out of existence, especially your larger creatures like your dinosaurs. They're large, they're more conspicuous, they take more food, they take more water, and they simply could not have lived in certain climates. And the unhospitable climate with the race for food, you see, prior to the flood, remember, we've got all this lush vegetation everywhere, no problem, food for everyone everywhere. Afterwards, you end up with deserts and barren polar caps. You don't have the food available like you had before. So there's going to be a race for food, and this is why many, if not most, of our large creatures got pushed right out of the picture of history, as well as creatures like the woolly mammoth. Remember how much water and how much vegetation he took per day. Now, you see, there have been birds like the pteranodon, which was a giant prehistoric bird, which we have found full remains to in the past. This bird's no longer with us. Why? Difference in air pressure and air density. He could not support himself in the air with his 20-foot wingspan because the air pressure and air density would have been different after the collapse of the water vapor canopy. You see, on just about every creature, something, if they're no longer with us today, there is some way we can explain it because basically of the change in the Earth's environment. And the pteranodon is just one example of a bird that has become extinct, as well as a lot of others that we could mention, but the pteranodon starts with a P. You probably have heard of the bird, but maybe don't recognize it. Pronounced with a T, but starts with a P, pteranodon. That has become extinct. Now, let's see. We don't have probably enough time to get into another subject. I guess we'll stop here, but what we'll begin looking at next time, this pretty much answers the question of extinction as well as what happened to the mammoths, those that were not on board the ark. But how did polar bears end up white and end up back where it's cold when it wasn't prior to when they were taken on board the ark? As well as a lot of different other creatures that end up in climates that are different than what they had prior to the ark, prior to the flood. Okay, I think we'll stop there. I don't think I have enough time to get into that subject very deeply then.